Great to see you, both of you.
Wonderful. So let's officially get started. I'm going to do my thing with the record button. So welcome, everybody. Excited to have you in class today. My name is Curry Sotner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. And today's class is all about federalism and separation of powers. And on the Friday classes, which we've deemed our Constitution Club, we get to bring in great speakers to that club. And today we have Professor Brooks. So for this class, Jeff's going to run the class, ask lots of questions, but we want lots of questions from you as well. So put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A, and let's get started. So Jeff, do you want to kick us off and get us moving?
That would be great. Hi, Curry, and welcome, Professor Brooks. It's so great to welcome you to our Friday class.
Thank you for having me.
Really excited to talk. There's so much we have to talk about, and I wanted to begin by asking you to tell our friends the story of John Rock, the first Black lawyer to argue before the U.S. Supreme Court. It's such an inspiring story. It has to do with the birth of birthright citizenship, and you've written about it so movingly. So tell us the story of John Rock.
Well, John Rock actually never had the opportunity to argue a case before the court. He died of tuberculosis in 1866 before he had the chance, unfortunately. But he was the first African-American admitted to the Supreme Court bar. He was born in South Jersey in Salem County in 1825. And I tell the story most simply. He was known to be a very precocious young man, did extremely well in school, became a teacher. While working as a teacher, studied medicine, was not admitted to medical school because of his race, and decided, well, if I can't become a physician, well, I'm going to become a dentist. So he became a dentist, practiced dentistry in the city of Philadelphia, taking a ferry across from where he moved to Camden, a little north of Salem County, and practiced dentistry there. Eventually got admitted to medical school, finished medical school, and moved with his wife to Boston in the early 1850s. And Boston at the time was a hotbed of abolitionism, a great place for somebody like Rock to go. And about 5 years after his time there, he'd taken ill. We assume tuberculosis had kicked in, and travels to France. And there's a long story about him being able to travel to France, because this is 1858. 1 year earlier was the Dred Scott decision. And in that decision, African Americans weren't really considered African Americans. They were Africans. They were not considered citizens, nor ever intended to be, to paraphrase from Chief Justice Taney. So being given the paperwork saying, hey, I'm a citizen, that was an issue. So anyway, long story short, he, with the help of Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, he's able to get the paperwork necessary to travel to France. His work done. He's in France for about 10 months, returns fluent in French and German, apparently, and is told upon his return, or actually while he was in France, he should not be practicing medicine any longer. And he's thinking, oh, I've been a teacher, I've been a dentist, I've been a physician. Well, let's become a lawyer. So he reads the law, and as one said back then, and law schools were not a requirement yet. And so he was a lawyer apprentice, as it were, and eventually becomes an attorney in 1861. The rule to become a member of the Supreme Court bar is that one needs to be in good standing in his or her jurisdiction for at least 3 years and have the recommendation of a member of the Supreme Court bar. In this case, it was Charles Sumner, the senator. There were a series of about a dozen letters between the two men to make this happen. And excuse me. And eventually, Rock is admitted in the beginning of February 1865, actually on the same day that Lincoln signed the 13th Amendment.
Wow. just an amazing story. It is so inspiring. And I think I read in your work at some point that he was moved to decide to become admitted to the Supreme Court because he was so outraged that he couldn't get a passport, and he wanted to argue before Tawney, who had written the infamous Dred Scott decision. Basically, he thought it was his opportunity to efface the stain of Dred Scott from the U.S. reports.
Yes, that was the hope. And there were also a number of other cases, especially fugitive slave law, which is something he railed against in numerous public speeches. Something else he fought hard for was the fair treatment of Black soldiers who had fought in the Civil War. Not that such a case would necessarily go to the Supreme Court, but by having a federal admittance, I guess he was thinking that may help him in that regard too.
So important, and friends can learn some of John Rock's story at the Constitution Center's exhibit on the Civil War and Reconstruction, the battle for freedom and equality, where we have Dred Scott's original petition, the one he signed with an X, as well as the story of John Rock and other heroic advocates for equality. I know we're here to talk about federalism, and I'm going to ask you in a moment about James Wilson, who's another crucial, inspiring founder you've written about. But what should our friends learn about the lessons that emerged about citizenship from the Reconstruction amendments? Of course, the 14th Amendment overturns Dred Scott and says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the U.S. and the state wherein they reside. What are the big ideas that we should know about?
The big ideas with respect to citizenship, the big ideas are we have to remember a number of things. Well, the first thing I would think of would be the whole concept of citizenship and its evolution. This idea that in 1776, people thought of themselves as citizens per se. That was something very new. I mean, you have to remember that all of those men and women were subjects. And in this concept of being a subject is something perhaps quite foreign to us, right? Being a subject of a king, subject of a queen, subordinate to. And then we get into the question of sovereignty, which is very much related to this, if we want to think about big ideas here, very much related to this is the idea of sovereignty, right? Who is the sovereign, or who are the sovereign? And in the British system, the sovereign would have been the monarch, or in any monarchical system, the sovereign is the monarch. And then under, the writings of people like William Blackstone, the thinking was, well, that sovereignty is transferred, any sovereignty that the people had is transferred to a parliament. So the problem with that is, of course, in the American understanding, especially if we think about somebody like James Wilson or Benjamin Rush, or two Scots by heritage, their thinking of sovereignty is that the sovereignty remains the sovereignty or the power. The sovereignty meaning, if you're sovereign, I should explain, means that you have control, right? And that control or sovereignty remains with the people. It's not transferred to another body, like say today. It wouldn't be transferred to Congress. They're not even really borrowing. We the people still have that power. So if we go to the question of citizenship and sovereignty. So if we the people have the power, and we the people see ourselves as citizens. So in other words, we are a people that work together, that have rights by birth. There's something very unique about the American design. And this idea develops over time. And it's not sort of this idea that from the beginning, from 1776 or 1787, everything was perfect. It wasn't. It still isn't. it is a work in progress. It was a work in progress, and it continues to be a work in progress. And that's something I think a lot of people need to keep in mind. It was better when, or it will be. We're a work in progress. And the more we read about this, the more we sort of immerse ourselves in these topics, as a nation, the better I think we will become.
Well, I'm so glad that you gave that very core definition of citizenship, and also it provides a wonderful bridge for me to ask you about James Wilson, who you've also written about so powerfully in your book, Chisholm to Alden, James Wilson's Artificial Person in American Supreme Court History. Wilson, of course, was the founder who, more than anyone else, came up with the idea that we, the people of the United States as a whole, are sovereign, as opposed to the king in parliament or some tyrant. Tell us, first of all, the story of James Wilson. Give us, because he was another fascinating personal story, a rather tragic one. Yeah. And then tell us what was, so help us understand who he was as a person, what he had a rather rough end, and what was his central contribution to sovereignty.
Well, short, he was born in Scotland, 1742. He came to America in 1765. And for those of you learning about U.S. history now, 1765 was an especially important year. The Stamp Act went into effect, and many historians would agree that was really the impetus behind what ultimately will lead to the American Revolution. And that was this act by Parliament to impose direct taxes. So, excuse me. So he arrives in Philadelphia in 1765, eventually trains to be a lawyer, and under John Dickinson. And the thing with Wilson, who had studied at, well, let's see, he had taken courses at St. Andrews, at Edinburgh, and at Glasgow, under a number of the well-known, well, at the time, Scottish Enlightenment philosophers, such as Francis Hutcheson, Thomas Reid. And these people, these individuals, had conceptualized, to boil it down, this idea that the people could, as a group, decide what was best for them. It was really very democratic. And if we move into some of Wilson's thinking and his jurisprudence, Wilson was one of only 6 people to sign both the Declaration and the Constitution, for example. So he was really in the thick of all of it during the founding era. He's second only after Madison for speaking at the convention. Wilson had this idea, for example, he argued that people of all ages, sexes, and conditions should have a right to vote. It was radical. Even for these days, that's radical. Wow. It may be a discussion with some of the folks that are, in junior high now, thinking that they might be able to vote when they're 16. Wilson would say yes. Most of the founders would say no, but Wilson would have said yes. Wilson also called for the direct election of senators. It's also something radical. Benjamin Rush, another Scotsman, very much influenced by Scottish common sense, even though I think he was born stateside of Scottish origin, he had wanted a unified country. In the separation of powers that we talk about wouldn't even be an issue. But then we get into people like Alexander Hamilton, who said, hey, a nation this big, that's impossible, right? We should even be thinking about electing a king if we, talk about Hamilton. So one more thing about Wilson. So one little fun fact about Wilson, before we get into the tragedy.
Yeah.
So Wilson was also the first person who was actually sworn in to serve as a Supreme Court justice.
Oh, wow.
And he tutored Bushrod Washington. Bushrod Washington became a justice in 1798 and took Wilson's seat. George Washington it was George Washington's nephew. George Washington's brother had passed away, and he took care of his nephew, like son, Bushrod. Went to study law under Wilson, and there's a letter in which Washington says, "Hey, I know that Wilson's really expensive, but he's worth it. He is the wisest lawyer we have." I mean, he was known for being learned in French law. He actually tutored Latin and Greek at what is now the University of Pennsylvania, lectured law. His law lectures are actually available. You can Google them, called James Wilson's Works. His law lectures, 1790-91, he was lecturing at what is now the University of Pennsylvania.
I'm so glad you recommended Wilson's law lectures. Friends, as Professor Book suggests, check those lectures out online. They are the most thorough encapsulation of the philosophy of the founding that you can ever get. He was completely brilliant, and you'll just see the distillation of that idea of popular sovereignty that Professor Brooks just described better than anywhere else. So I'll begin the story, and then you finish it, just because I can't resist. So Wilson, during the Revolution, as you said, he signs the Declaration, but some people think he's too conservative, that he might have Tory sympathies. So this mob goes to his house and tries to break in and burn it. And it's called Fort Wilson. And I actually visited I went to Market Street and 3rd Philly recently, and it's now a CVS. The house is not there anymore. But he barricades himself in with his wife, and then the mob gets tired or gets drunk and goes home. Despite that doesn't dim his devotion to popular sovereignty. And as you say, he is so central at the convention in defending we, the people of the United States, as sovereign, and championing direct election of senators, the popular election of the presidency. He's responsible for the compromise of the Electoral College. As you suggest, he probably has more influence of the Constitution than anyone, maybe aside from Madison, and maybe even more than that. So he's this huge figure. He then wants to get appointed to the Supreme Court, and there are these letters where he's writing to President Washington, make me Chief Justice. I'm sorry to put myself forward, but I'd really like to be chief. But Washington doesn't pick him because he has a weakness, and that is debt. He's a big land speculator, and he's constantly losing money.
If I may interject, actually, one of the other issues with Wilson was that he asked that Washington, in that letter that you're referring to, I believe, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't have a letter in front of me, he said something to the effect of, I didn't ask for any of my posts, so who were you? That was considered dishonorable in the 18th century. Now we think about our brand. That was very askance. That was looked very negatively in the 18th century. That will change drastically, I think, but once we get into the age of Jackson, in the latter 1820s, 1830s, and I think that people, developing a brand, as we say today, becomes increasingly more commonplace. Politicians didn't speak up for themselves. The thinking was that if you were good enough, the people around you would speak on your behalf, and you didn't need to speak for yourself.
Totally fascinating that he broke the norm that way. Well, you've written so importantly about the main case he decided on the Supreme Court, which was Chisholm in Georgia. So maybe tell us about that case, and then tell us how he had a kind of sad end.
So Chisholm versus Georgia, in a nutshell, was a case where, a man named William Farquhar had produced uniforms and other items for revolutionary soldiers in the state of Georgia. And he passes away. He is the executor of his state, the person responsible for handling his will and everything, was a man named Alexander Chisholm. And he sues to get this money back into the state. Farquhar had left a daughter behind who was at the time quite young. And long story short, the ultimate legal question was, can Georgia be sued, or is it sovereign? And here's the thing, one of the aspects or under the sort of legal understandings at the time was that a sovereign cannot be sued. And it's still an understanding today, to be fair. A sovereign cannot be sued unless the sovereign allows itself to be sued. So one question I love to ask my students, for example, if I'm teaching like constitutional history or legal history or something, and we get to this subject, I'll say, okay, let's pretend you are selling projectors to a school district, to the state of New Jersey, okay? And you live in Pennsylvania, okay? So you make your projectors, you put them on a truck, you bring them over the Delaware, over into New Jersey, and New Jersey never pays you. Question, does New Jersey need to pay you? The answer, well, of course they do. There's a great word in German, Jein, yes and no. And so ultimately, in that scenario, unless, then there's always these clauses, and if you look at contracts, you'll see a clause that where disputes will be settled, and how a party opens itself to dispute. Is it, is it in a court of law? Is it in a court in California? Is it in New York? Is it whatever? For a state, if it doesn't open itself up to lawsuit somewhere in that agreement, it can't be sued. That needs to be in there because the states enjoy a certain level of sovereignty, right? And that protection. And the old adage was that, you can't sue the king, right? So this was the question in Chisholm, really. And Wilson, in his opinion, he basically says that the state is an artificial person, and as such, is open to suit. The problem with that is the reality, the states were broke. And what ultimately happens is this decision leads to a flood of litigation, a flood of lawsuits by various vendors suing states for things the states hadn't paid for during the Revolution. Now, mind you, under the Articles of Confederation, the document, the precursor to the Constitution, it couldn't, the Continental Congress couldn't, start taxing people, right? Everything was up to the states. So the issue was, you know what? We got a problem here. We can't pay this. This wasn't what we intended. We need to amend the Constitution. So when we know the Bill of Rights, first 10 amendments, right? Number 11 is basically overruling Chisholm, right? Principally says, look, these sovereign states cannot be sued without their say-so. They are sovereign states. Wilson, of course, I don't see much in the way of public comment on that after the fact by Wilson, but I'll get to the tragic part of his life. Because he was involved in a lot of shady land deals, something tells me he was indirectly involved in the first stock market crash in U.S. history in 1792, which was really William Dewar of the Assistant Secretary of State, and using his knowledge and misusing his knowledge and leading to a absolute fiasco where actually there were people in front of the jail in New York with nooses in their hands wanting to pull him out of the jail and hang him. People lost everything due to Dewar, but I'm getting off topic. So back to Wilson. So Wilson is involved in some of these land deals, shady, we're going to get investors from the Netherlands or investors from here or there and well, we're going to buy the land for a penny an acre, and you'll be able to sell it for 3 pennies an acre or what have you. Long story short, didn't work out that way for a host of reasons. Some of these problems end up, I think the word shady is understating the fact, it lands Wilson in jail. Wilson is incarcerated in Trenton, New Jersey, while a sitting justice of the United States Supreme Court. He's released and basically dies broke in North Carolina.
That's an amazing story.
Yeah.
What a contrast to move from coming up with the idea of popular sovereignty to being incarcerated as a Supreme Court justice, dying in poverty. I see in the chat box we have some great comments. Giving Wilson some love, despite the fact that he was kind of dissed in the musical 1776 as a kind of buffoonish character. What do you think it's because of his sad end that he doesn't get the respect that he deserves? Because
I think so. He was described as being aloof, very bookish. This is a man who got a full ride to St. Andrews at 14 years old, right? A bursarship, as they called them in Britain, full scholarship. 14 years old. He was one of 6 children, very poor family, or tenant farmers ultimately, in Scotland, in a small village called Casperdoe, which no longer exists, in the county of Fife, just north of Edinburgh, actually. You get there by train in about 30 minutes. So he really came from nothing. His parents wanted him to become a minister because that was the way for a very intelligent person from lower means, financial means, to be seen as honorable in society at the time. But for a host of reasons, he steered away from that. And there's some letters actually at the Historical Society in Pennsylvania, actually over a Locust in Philadelphia. In these letters from his mother, telling how James has lost his way and how sad she is and heartbroken she is that Jamie boy has not gone on to wear the collar. It was really a thing with his family that he didn't follow through with that.
That's amazing. Just out of curiosity, because I'd love to know about them, are those letters online, or are they only at the...
They are not.
Yeah.
They are not, and I've never published them, unfortunately. Let me, you know what? If you or Carrie Carrie, reach out to me. Let me look into that. Let me see what I can do.
It would be great, because we have, thanks to the Historical Society, they lent us Wilson's original draft of the Constitution, those very first handwritten drafts, which are the most sacred texts imaginable. We put those online and would love to just spread as much light about Wilson as possible.
Yes.
Let me ask you, I'm going to call up the interactive Constitution, if I can. Curry, can I do that quickly? To ask about Chisholm? Can you guys see it? Okay. So you mentioned the 11th Amendment, the first amendment to overturn a Supreme Court decision. And let's just read it. The judicial power of the United States shall not be construed to extend to any suit in law or equity commenced or prosecuted against one of the United States by citizens of another state or by citizens or subject of any foreign state. So that seems to say, when I read it, that a citizen of another state cannot sue a particular state. If I'm in Virginia, the state of Virginia can't be sued by a citizen of Pennsylvania. And yet the Supreme Court has interpreted that much more broadly to mean that a state can't be sued under some circumstances, even by its own citizens. Has the Supreme Court been faithful to the original understanding of the 11th Amendment or not?
Oh, well, it depends on whom you ask. If you're asking me, I would say not entirely. But because when you see here, let me mention something about this any foreign state. There were, in the press, there was this these comments that Mr. Chisholm was a foreign citizen. He was actually a citizen of South Carolina, but they were saying he was a foreign citizen. So this is thrown into the amendment. The other thing is, if you look to, could you go to Article 3 of the Constitution, please?
Absolutely, sir. That's what the interactive Constitution is all about. As long as I don't have screen sharing, we're going to go to issues. We're going to go to Article 3 right here.
And Section 2, right there, Section 2. There you go. And it's highlighted right there, the controversies between two or more states, between state and citizens of another state. So it's in the Constitution originally to allow for these kinds of lawsuits.
Mm-hmm.
The 11th Amendment overrules this, right? So here we have a dilemma. So if we go to original meaning, this was the original intention of the founders because this was in the Constitution, right? But what happened, as I said, the reality was largely because of, I would say, I argue for financial reasons, couldn't afford it. It is no longer. So, but if we're talking about original intent of the founders, I would say definitely not.
Yeah.
The original drafters of the 11th Amendment, perhaps, but then there are exceptions to this, right? There's the, excuse me, there's a 1908 case where, in Minnesota, I believe it was, where a state officer had done something illegal, and the action of that person opened him up to lawsuit. So the saying sort of was, if the king can do no wrong, somebody must have. And in this case, the officer still needs to bear in mind the laws which he or she has sworn to protect. So a sovereignty or some sort of immunity has its limits, right? From being kept out of a lawsuit. So I would honestly say that for the most part, yes, not entirely. It is a highly complicated issue. This issue of state sovereignty. Well, quite honestly, I think the whole idea of sovereignty and federalism is probably the underbelly of most of our major problems today. Certainly was for the Civil War, and I would say continues even now into the 21st century.
Well, that's such a powerful and important statement. And maybe I'm going to ask you one more question and then turn it back to Curry. For Wilson, we, the people of the whole United States, are sovereign, and he's rejecting the idea of state sovereignty. Lincoln invokes Wilson's argument when he says that the Southern states have no power to secede during the Civil War, because Lincoln, channeling Wilson, says since the whole people made the Union, you need the consent of the whole people to change it. To what degree is that dispute about who is sovereign, the people of the United States or the people of each state, being played out today? Because as you say, it remains one of the most hotly contested questions in our constitutional debates.
Well, where do I begin? Since we're talking to schools, who pays for schools, right? How much impact or how much say do the folks in Washington have over curriculum or anything having to do with school building? And then we get to the power of the purse and how long those strings of the purse are, right? If the federal government is paying for some or part of it, then that money is contingent on certain behaviors and following certain rules. So that's really where, if we think about Madison in these spheres of influence, right? We think about two circles, and there's this crossover here. that sort of gray area between the two circles that cross over. Here's the states, here's the federal, there's a crossover, and in the middle there, that's the gray area where both parties have some sort of impact. Roads, right? Take a major road, Route 10 in the south, Route 80 in the north, or any sort of Route 95, any of these highways, they go through states, they go through towns. Who pays for it, right? And under what conditions and to what extent? Those are rules that need to be hashed out. They have been hashed out, but my understanding is that sometimes quite contentiously.
Fascinating. Curry, I see in the chat box, we're getting a lot of other topics. People are chatting, including voting rights. So what questions do you have for Professor Brooks from our friends as we conclude this fascinating discussion?
A few big ones. First of all, I believe all the under 16 and under are really excited because now they're going to have 16 to vote backed by Wilson as their new tagline. So thank you. I just wanted to point that out and thank you very much.
Oh no, I started a thing.
It was a great tagline. So if you start seeing signs in DC all around that, you'll know why. Because DC, I know the 16-year-olds in DC actually are getting some momentum. So when we think about the examples of federalism, and I love your Venn diagram hands, we talk about, the national government in the separation of powers, and then federalism between the national and the state. And we're constantly referencing, is this a parfait? Is it Neapolitan ice cream? Like, how do we break this up and see how it works? What would Wilson say about where we the people sit in all this separation of powers and all this dividing of powers?
So where do we the people sit with respect to the idea of federalism and the divide? At the end of the day, excuse me, we the people still retain our sovereignty. We the people still have the rights. We are the holders of those rights because we the people are the fallible creatures of a perfect God, to paraphrase Wilson. So for that, I mean, that's it in a nutshell. We're still at the center of it. We still have a say at all levels. I think too, there were some, I think it might have been Peter Onuf, a historian. I think he's the one who'd written about this, or it might have been Forrest McDonald or Peter Onuf, I can't recall, had written, when writing about the founding era, had talked about how Americans wanted to do away with the king, but needed something to replace it, and the federal government was that thing. And what we're seeing, in my estimation today, is that growing and growing. I personally don't think that the federal government was ever intended to be nearly as big as it is. And it's not one party or the other party. We can point fingers and all that. It is something that has happened over time, for over decades, right? Where the federal government, because people have kind of thrown their hands up or just were desperate and wanted to ask for one group for help. With that, the federal government said, well, I guess I have to do something. We have to do something here, and did. And in the process of that, I think it's left people thinking, hey, are we still the sovereign? The government, as if the government is not of us, they're separate from us. That's, I think, in a lot of people's minds. Because of that, they are either looked down upon, praised, but something I always like to remind people, the president, the Speaker of the House, no one in Congress is going to fill your potholes, right? That's local government. Local elections matter. They arguably matter more than the federal election. Yet, if you look at the numbers for turnout, the numbers for turnout in the national elections statistically are 3, 4, 5 times what they are for local elections. Either should be the same or the other way around.
That is great. And thank you for saying that, because it is so unbelievably important. And students are really connected to the local elections too. When talking about school boards or people in their community that are being up, they should pay attention to those as well. So Elon asked a really great question. And the question is, do you think the federal versus states' rights, these issues have come up because the world has gotten smaller in a way that how technology drives what's happening in states, between the federal government and the state, and the comparison between states?
I think they've always been. They're just manifesting themselves in a different way. They're coming up in a different way because the questions are different. No one in the 18th, 19th, or actually through most of the 20th century was worried about computer firewalls or hacks. It just wasn't a thing. So I think the only thing really in the 20th century might have been the Y2K non-event, whenever, for those of us who were around at the time, when we thought the whole world was going to end because computers were all going to crash and all our money would disappear from the bank, which never happened. But I would say it just manifests itself in a different way. It's nothing new. I think
nothing new, just changing direction.
Changing direction, new problems.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was unbelievably helpful. And I also, we love at the Constitution Center making fun constitutional t-shirts. I kid you not. We have millions of them. Cool. Our teachers wear them all the time. My new one might be, we are not subjects, we are citizens, and we are who are sovereign. So I absolutely love that from the beginning of this. It's a great conversation on Wilson, on understanding how federalism works and the layers of the government and the relationship between the nation and the states and the people. So thank you so much for this class. It was so fun.
And if you make these t-shirts, I'm not joking, I want one.
Oh, definitely. We're gonna send you the Constitution nerd one too, because we know you would love that as well.
I will admit I am a Constitution nerd. Here's my pocket Constitution.
You started that way. I was like,
oh, you're getting
a Constitution. Yeah, we embrace Constitution nerd here. We live it. And yes, good question. So Emily will work on the students getting those t-shirts too, because we absolutely want to make sure every age can embrace their constitutional nerd. So thank you so much for a great conversation. Jeff, thank you so much for leading us through this awesome conversation and bringing up Fort Wilson, because it is one of my favorite stories.
Not too far from you guys.
No, we do a walking tour past it in the summer.
I actually, let me know, I'll go. That's great.
Well, we would love to have you for lots of Wilson tours, spreading lights about Wilson, Wilson letters, and our new Wilson meme, #Wilson rules. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
You were just superb. Thanks for teaching us so much.
Have a good rest of the day.
You too.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Happy Friday.